period doesn't actually exist because they see the time period of post-childhood as the person is an adult. They are self-supporting and they are doing things that adults are doing. So in that case, there's not really an adolescence time period. So it depends on culture, and sometimes in American culture, that means it's being extended because people are in school longer, living at home longer. For all of those reasons, that time period gets extended. So there's also the physical aspect of development at this stage. Puberty obviously being a big marker of that, and that is the time when humans mature sexually. So for girls, this is about age 11 on average, and boys 13. They experience a surge of hormones, and that triggers all the bodily changes. So there are changes in, a lot of these changes are the secondary sex characteristics. So the primary sex characteristics are those that are related to reproduction. So it would be the ovaries, the testes, and external genitalia. The secondary sex characteristics are non-reproductive. So these are things that happen or change in puberty, such as breasts, hip development, voice changes, and facial hair. During adolescence, your brain is pruning. What this means is that all of that amazing learning that was going on between ages 1 to 3 especially, but continuing on in childhood, you either use it or lose it. And that starts in adolescence, meaning neural networks that you might have had developing, if you didn't continue on in learning more of those things, those neural networks would weaken and die. And the ones that you are focused on in adolescence would strengthen. Also, as a review, we talked about the frontal lobe, the part of your brain responsible for planning, judgment, impulse control, and decision making. That part of your brain is not fully developed as an adolescent. It's not fully developed until you are 25. So ideas in education or in law especially, they take into consideration, or organizations such as the American Psychological Association really encourage them to take into consideration that fact that they don't have impulse control the same way that an adult does. The frontal lobe is not fully developed. So impulse control and decision making are not as strong. Those are still things that are developing. So when it comes to issues such as the death penalty for a 16 or 17-year-old, that could be an important factor. So let's talk about the development of morality. So a guy named Lawrence Kohlberg studied Piaget and his cognitive development, and he came up with moral stages that he believed all humans go through starting from childhood. And there are 3 basic levels. So he asked them all this question. It was a question about a guy who named Heinz, you might have heard the story, whose wife was dying of cancer, and a druggist who came up with a medicine to cure it. But he knew he could make a lot of money off of it, and so he was charging a lot of money. And Heinz could not afford the drug. He tried to come up with enough money, but only had enough to pay half of it. When he went to the druggist and said to the druggist, I only have half, could you sell it to me? The druggist said, no, this is what it costs. So the question was, should Heinz steal the drug? So so he used this as his guide for, along with some other questions, to decide what stage is this person in these 3 moral stages. So it's not the yes or no, if they say yes, he should steal the drug, or no, he shouldn't. It's the explanation why. It's the judgment. It's the way the person is thinking about the question from an ethical and moral standpoint. All right, so Here are the 3 stages. You do need to know these. They are vocab. The first one is pre-conventional morality. So the focus here is on self-interest. You should do the thing. It is morally right to do the thing if it makes you feel good, if it brings you a good outcome. If it doesn't bring you a good outcome, you shouldn't do it. So it's all about you. It's self-absorbed. Conventional morality, which is where the majority of adults and adolescents fall, is like what the conventional idea, right? It's upholding laws and social rules or actual rules to gain social approval or to maintain order. So, for example, in that Heinz scenario, saying something like, well, if you steal the drug, you shouldn't steal the drug because if you do, everyone will think you're a criminal. So because of how everyone thinks, that's why you shouldn't do something. That's conventional thinking. Post-conventional, which only some make it into, would say something about the idea that values, universal truths, such as life being more important than property, it is how people should make their decision making based on. That's a post-conventional way of thinking. So in the Heinz scenario, someone saying a person's life to live is more important than property or money would be an example of post-conventional. So there are limitations and criticisms to Kohlberg. He only studied white men in America. Carol Gilligan criticized him for not studying women at all and saying that women actually thought differently. She came up with her own moral stages. He was also criticized because he only studied one culture. And we are an individualist culture in America, meaning we are more focused and describe and think in ways that are related to the self and not the broader society and country, for example, we live in. So collectivist cultures, such as China, for example, would not necessarily think the same. And that doesn't make one more moral or less moral than the other. It just means that you can't base a whole moral theory on one culture, white males in America. So Jonathan Haidt said that we actually have something called moral intuition. And these are quick gut, automatic and emotion-driven reactions. And these are often related to other sensory or other things going on. So for example, holding a warm cup of tea. In a study, they found that people responded to people they were interviewing or talking to and saw them in a much more positive and kind way. And they ended up being more generous just by holding a warm cup of tea. If someone has a disgusting taste in their mouth, they're actually more likely to feel disgusted by someone in the room. So moral disgust or feeling like someone is a good person is actually not all just like how you think. It's also about your senses and what you're experiencing. So there's a runway trolley headed for 5 people. I'm sure you've heard this little scenario before. All will be killed unless you throw a switch that diverts the trolley onto another track, where it will kill 1 person. So 5 people are going to be killed unless you hit the switch and kill the 1 person. So should you throw that switch? Most say yes, kill the 1 person to save the 5. So it's a numbers game. But let's say it was the same scenario and now you have to push the larger stranger onto the tracks where he will die as his body is going to stop the trolley. So you have to actually physically do the pushing. You're not just pushing a switch, you're pushing this full adult human being onto the tracks. So in this same scenario, one person would die, 5 would be saved, but most feel intuitively, gut reaction is no, they don't want to, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't push someone on. So this gives evidence that our moral intuition, that our moral emotions, so that gut feeling of like, ooh, that doesn't feel right. And then we explain it, right? We have that gut reaction of like, well, I wouldn't push them. I wouldn't do that. And so then we change our moral reasoning because of that. Because it's like, kill 1, save 5, but wait, you're still killing 1 and saving 5, but now you don't want to do it. So our emotions change our reasoning, our judgment. Others say that we rely on this moral emotion, but we can override this automatic thought by really stopping and thinking it out, which we don't always do. All right, last thing, this is pretty interesting. So moral action. So moral action is also influenced by society, right? So everyone is so perplexed by the Nazis and how many people, like, were those all terrible human beings, right? And the answer is no. People would not have described those concentration Nazi camp guards in their previous life before the Holocaust as being bad people generally. They were considered being good people, neighborly, good workers, co-workers, right? But the power of the situation can override those things and affect good people. So it's very hard to, and we're going to talk about this a lot more in a later chapter, but the idea that good people can do horrible acts is a very true thing. And that is because of the influence of the situation. There is power in a situation for a lot of reasons. All right, so also in moral action, education teaches empathy for others. So remember how we talked about in Kohlberg early on, and this is generally true even if you don't like Kohlberg, that little children, very little, they're able to think of others, but they're also very self-absorbed. So education programs that are focused on moral action, meaning doing works of service, are actually crucial to, important to promoting empathy for others. And in fact, just doing those acts of services creates a moral attitude, meaning wanting to be or feeling more empathy towards others. So it will provoke more and more action. So it's like a cycle. So having a teen in a service program, they're going to want to serve more. And it actually makes them more motivated in many other aspects of their schooling and of their life. So moral action feeds moral attitude. Takeaways. Kohlberg, remember those 3 moral stages and what they mean. Understand the criticism against him, especially by Carol Gilligan. Make sure you understand what moral intuition is and the idea that moral action feeds moral attitude. That sums up 13.1 to 13.3, and I will see you in class. Thanks.